Hello my dear friends, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're exploring one of the darkest and most shocking stories hidden inside history, the story of Whitney Houston. Let's get started. There was a time when Whitney Houston seemed almost untouchable. Her voice was so powerful, so emotional, and so flawless that millions of people believed they were listening to something almost supernatural. She broke records across the world, sold millions of albums, starred in blockbuster films, and became one of the most beloved singers in modern history. To her fans, Whitney wasn't just a celebrity. She was the voice of an entire generation. But behind the fame, behind the perfect smile, and behind the glittering stage lights, Whitney Houston was quietly falling apart. The woman the world saw as a legend was battling loneliness, pressure, addiction, emotional pain, and a level of fame that eventually became impossible to survive. By the final years of her life, the same world that once worshipped her seemed obsessed with watching her collapse. And perhaps the saddest part of all was this. Whitney Houston spent most of her life trying to protect everyone else while slowly losing herself. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born in 1963 in Newark, New Jersey, into one of the most talented musical families in America. Music surrounded her from the very beginning. Her mother, Cissy Houston, was a respected gospel singer with an extraordinary voice. Her cousin was the legendary singer Dionne Warwick. Family friend Aretha Franklin often appeared around Whitney's childhood world. For most children, those names would sound unbelievable. For Whitney, it was normal life. She grew up inside churches filled with gospel music, emotion, and powerful singing. From a young age, people around her realized something special was happening whenever Whitney sang. Her voice carried remarkable strength, control, and emotional depth even as a child. Adults would stop and stare. Church members would become emotional during performances. It was obvious Whitney possessed a rare gift. But talent also brought pressure. Whitney's mother pushed her hard because she understood how difficult and dangerous the music industry could become. Cissy Houston demanded discipline, professionalism, and perfection. Mistakes were not easily accepted. Whitney learned very early that people expected greatness from her at all times. And Whitney desperately wanted to make people proud. Unlike rebellious young celebrities who enjoyed shocking the public, Whitney was naturally shy and sensitive. Friends later described her as funny, warm, emotional, and deeply caring. But she also struggled with insecurity beneath her public image. She worried constantly about disappointing people. Approval mattered enormously to her. As Whitney grew older, her beauty and voice attracted attention quickly. She began modeling as a teenager and soon entered the music industry professionally. Record executives immediately recognized her potential. But they also saw something else. Whitney Houston could become a global superstar unlike anyone before her. She possessed crossover appeal capable of reaching pop, R&B, soul, and mainstream audiences simultaneously. That level of potential created enormous expectations. When Whitney released her debut album in 1985, the response was explosive. Songs like Saving All My Love for You, How Will I Know, and Greatest Love of All transformed her into an international sensation almost overnight. Her voice sounded effortless, emotional, and technically perfect. Audiences around the world fell in love with her instantly. And Whitney handled fame with grace at first. She smiled constantly during interviews. She appeared elegant, polished, and kind. Record companies loved her image because she looked sophisticated and approachable at the same time. America embraced Whitney Houston as the perfect superstar, talented, beautiful, respectful, and universally marketable. But behind that image, pressure was already building. Whitney's success grew so quickly that she barely had time to process what was happening. Every album needed to be bigger than the last. Every performance needed to sound perfect. Every public appearance faced intense media attention. Millions of people expected Whitney Houston to remain flawless forever. That kind of pressure slowly became suffocating. Some critics accused Whitney of sounding too polished or too mainstream. Others questioned whether she was black enough for certain audiences because of her crossover success in pop music. Whitney found herself trapped between industries, audiences, expectations, and public opinions she could never fully control. And emotionally, she began struggling more than people realized. Despite appearing confident publicly, Whitney often felt isolated inside her fame. She wanted privacy, authenticity, and emotional freedom, but celebrity culture rarely allowed those things. Every interview, every relationship, every outfit, and every decision became public discussion. The more famous she became, the harder it became for her to simply exist as a normal human being. Then came The Bodyguard. In 1992, Whitney starred alongside Kevin Costner in what would become one of the most successful romantic films of the decade. The movie transformed her from music superstar into global icon status. And when she performed, "I Will Always Love You," the world seemed to stop. The song became legendary. Her performance reached emotional levels few artists in history have ever matched. Millions of people still remember hearing that voice for the first time, powerful, vulnerable, heartbreaking, and unforgettable all at once. Whitney Houston now stood at the absolute peak of fame. But behind the scenes, her personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. Around this period, Whitney's relationship with singer Bobby Brown became one of the most talked about celebrity relationships in America. Their chemistry was intense, emotional, chaotic, and deeply controversial. To outsiders, they often appeared completely opposite. Whitney carried the polished image of a global superstar. Bobby Brown projected rebellious energy, unpredictability, and public controversy. Yet Whitney loved him deeply. Many people around her worried about the relationship from the beginning. Media coverage quickly turned vicious. Tabloids portrayed Bobby as a dangerous influence pulling Whitney toward destructive behavior. Every argument, public appearance, or rumor became national gossip. The couple lived under relentless public pressure almost constantly. And Whitney started changing. Over time, fans noticed signs of emotional exhaustion. Interviews became more uncomfortable. Rumors about substance use began spreading through the entertainment industry. Whitney sometimes appeared distant, overwhelmed, or emotionally fragile in ways the public had never seen before. The pressure surrounding her life became unbearable. Imagine being one of the most famous women on earth while cameras followed your every movement. Imagine millions of strangers discussing your marriage, your body, your behavior, and your mental health every single day. Whitney no longer belonged only to herself. She had become a global spectacle. And the music industry kept demanding more. Tours, performances, recordings, interviews, appearances, the machine around Whitney Houston never stopped moving. The people making money from her success needed the legend to continue no matter how exhausted or emotionally broken she became behind the scenes. Somewhere during those years, Whitney began relying more heavily on drugs. At first, many people around her tried denying the seriousness of the situation. Rumors circulated constantly, but Whitney still possessed enough talent and charisma to protect her public image. Fans wanted to believe their idol remained strong. Industry executives wanted to protect a billion-dollar superstar. But addiction does not care about fame. And slowly, cracks began appearing everywhere. Friends later described Whitney becoming increasingly isolated from certain people who genuinely cared about her. The environment surrounding her grew more chaotic. Emotional stress, relationship struggles, career pressure, and substance abuse started combining into something extremely dangerous. Yet whenever Whitney stood on stage and sang, moments of magic still appeared. That made the tragedy even more painful. Because audiences could still hear flashes of the extraordinary woman she used to be. Beneath the exhaustion and emotional damage, Whitney's voice still carried beauty powerful enough to move millions. Fans desperately hoped she would recover completely. They wanted the old Whitney back. But the deeper her private struggles became, the harder it became to separate the real woman from the global icon everyone expected her to remain forever. And behind the glamorous image presented to the world, Whitney Houston's life was slowly beginning to collapse in ways that would soon become impossible to hide anymore. By the early 2000s, the world was no longer watching Whitney Houston with admiration alone. Now it was watching with concern. The woman once known for elegance, perfection, and one of the greatest voices ever recorded was beginning to look exhausted in public appearances. Interviews became uncomfortable. Performances grew inconsistent. Rumors about addiction spread everywhere across tabloids, television, and the internet. Fans who once celebrated Whitney's success were now asking a painful question. What was happening to her? And sadly, the answer was becoming harder to hide. Whitney Houston had entered a dangerous cycle of emotional pain, substance abuse, public pressure, and personal instability. The fame that once elevated her now seemed to be consuming her piece by piece. Every mistake became headlines. Every appearance became evidence for gossip websites and paparazzi stories. Instead of protecting her, celebrity culture began feeding on her suffering. And the world watched everything happen in real time. One of the most shocking moments came during Whitney's interviews in the early 2000s. Audiences noticed dramatic changes in her appearance and behavior. She looked thinner, more fragile, more emotionally drained. Her once effortless confidence sometimes disappeared behind nervous laughter, emotional outbursts, or visible exhaustion. Yet even then, Whitney tried to smile through it. Perhaps the most famous interview of that era was her televised conversation with Diane Sawyer in 2002. During the interview, Whitney openly discussed rumors about drug use while trying to defend herself against growing public criticism. Some moments felt heartbreaking because beneath the celebrity image, viewers could see a woman struggling under enormous emotional pressure. And one phrase from that interview became legendary. "Crack is cheap. I make too much money to ever smoke crack." The line spread everywhere across television and media. Some people mocked it, others defended her, but underneath the headlines and internet jokes, something much sadder was happening. Whitney Houston was becoming entertainment for a world obsessed with celebrity breakdowns. The media storm around her became relentless. Paparazzi followed her constantly. Tabloids printed humiliating stories almost daily. Every rumor about her marriage, health, addiction, or emotional state generated enormous public attention. Instead of seeing Whitney as a human being struggling emotionally, much of the media transformed her into a spectacle. And fame became a prison. Whitney reportedly struggled deeply with trust during those years. She no longer knew who genuinely cared about her versus who benefited financially from remaining close to her. Addiction often isolates people emotionally, and for celebrities, that isolation becomes even more extreme because privacy almost disappears completely. Meanwhile, her marriage to Bobby Brown continued deteriorating publicly. Arguments, arrests, emotional instability, and constant rumors surrounded the relationship for years. The public largely blamed Bobby Brown for Whitney's decline, portraying him as the primary destructive influence in her life. But the truth was likely far more complicated than simple headlines suggested. Whitney herself was battling enormous internal pain. People close to her later described a woman carrying years of emotional exhaustion, insecurity, loneliness, and pressure beneath the surface. Fame had turned her into a global icon, but somewhere inside, Whitney still seemed to crave normal love, emotional safety, and acceptance. And drugs temporarily numbed that pain. But addiction always takes something in return. Over time, Whitney's health visibly declined. Concert cancellations increased. Some live performances shocked fans because the powerful voice that once seemed almost supernatural no longer sounded the same consistently. There were still moments where flashes of the old Whitney appeared, moments where audiences could briefly hear the greatness that once conquered the world. Those moments made everything even more tragic. Because people could still see her fighting. She wanted to recover. She wanted stability. She wanted peace. But addiction, public pressure, emotional trauma, and years of exhaustion had created a battle far more difficult than most outsiders fully understood. And yet, Whitney never completely lost the love of her fans. Even during her darkest years, millions of people continued rooting for her desperately. Fans defended her online. Audiences cried during comeback performances. The world wanted Whitney Houston to survive because her voice had become deeply connected to people's lives, memories, relationships, and emotions. She wasn't just a singer anymore. She was part of people's personal histories. Eventually, Whitney attempted several comebacks. In 2009, she released the album I Look to You*, which many fans hoped would mark the beginning of a full recovery. The album achieved commercial success, and for a brief moment, optimism returned. Interviews appeared calmer. Whitney smiled more. Audiences wanted to believe the nightmare was finally ending. But behind the scenes, the struggle remained painfully difficult. Years of addiction and emotional stress had taken enormous physical and psychological tolls. Whitney's voice itself had suffered damage. Performing became more challenging. Public expectations remained impossibly high because people still compared every moment to the legendary Whitney Houston of the past. And no human being could realistically survive those comparisons forever. As the years passed, Whitney seemed caught between two identities: the global legend everyone remembered and the exhausted woman quietly trying to survive underneath that image. The pressure of carrying both identities at once became overwhelming. Then came February 2012. Whitney Houston traveled to Los Angeles for Grammy weekend celebrations. The music industry gathered once again around glamour, fame, and celebration, the same world that had both elevated and consumed her for decades. Reports later described Whitney appearing emotionally fragile in the days leading up to her death. Some people around her expressed concern about her condition. But few imagined what was about to happen. On February 11, 2012, Whitney Houston was found unresponsive inside a bathtub at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. The news shocked the entire world. For millions of people, it felt impossible to process. Whitney Houston, the voice that once seemed immortal, was suddenly gone at just 48 years old. Television stations interrupted programming. Social media exploded with grief. Fans gathered outside hotels, churches, and memorials crying openly. The official reports later revealed a heartbreaking combination of drowning, heart disease, and cocaine use. And suddenly, the tragedy people feared for years had become reality. But what made Whitney's death feel especially painful was that so many people had watched her struggle publicly for so long. The warning signs were visible. The emotional exhaustion was visible. The addiction was visible. Yet celebrity culture often treated her pain as entertainment rather than a serious human crisis. In death, the world once again focused on Whitney's music. Songs like I Will Always Love You, Greatest Love of All, and I Have Nothing returned to charts around the world. Fans revisited old performances and interviews, remembering the extraordinary talent that once stunned audiences into silence. Younger generations discovered her voice for the first time and understood immediately why Whitney Houston became a legend. Because even after everything, the voice remained timeless. And maybe that is the most heartbreaking part of Whitney Houston's story. Beneath the scandals, addiction headlines, and public collapse was still one of the greatest singers who ever lived. A woman whose talent was so extraordinary that people sometimes forgot she was human. Whitney carried impossible expectations for most of her life. She was expected to remain flawless, beautiful, successful, elegant, powerful, inspirational, but no human being can survive forever under that level of pressure without eventually breaking somewhere inside. And Whitney broke slowly in front of the entire world. Some blame fame. Some blame addiction. Some blame toxic relationships, the music industry, media exploitation, or emotional trauma. But perhaps Whitney Houston was not destroyed by one single thing alone. Perhaps she was crushed by the unbearable weight of becoming a global legend while still trying to remain an ordinary human being underneath it all. And despite everything that happened, the world never stopped loving her. Because when Whitney Houston sang, people felt something real. Something emotional. Something unforgettable. And long after the tragedy, the scandals, and the pain faded into history, her voice continued doing what it always did best. Making millions of people feel less alone. Thank you for joining me on today's journey into one of history's darkest hidden stories. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next mystery hidden inside history.